At the end of April last year, I finally fulfilled a lifelong dream and visited Japan for just under 3 weeks. I always knew saving for the trip was one of the first things I wanted to do once I had the means, but it came about faster than it might have thanks to a particular friend I made in 2022 through, you guessed it, Higurashi. Between conversations about the series, we quickly bonded over and aided one another in our respective efforts to learn English and Japanese, as well as my general interest in and want to visit the country. Between the end of April and the start of May, Japan has a string of bank holidays which constitute a significant chunk of the limited time off workers get in a year. Why not come then, my friend suggested. And so I did. I spent the first week with this friend travelling around the country, and the later part of my trip based in Tokyo with a different long-term online friend I managed to convince to join me. While in Japan, I didn't for the most part do any kind of vlogging. But I do nonetheless have a muddle of videos and photos, tips and memories and experiences I want to share and preserve, so that's what this video is. If you are travelling to another continent and have the option, I would recommend booking the day before you fly off work. I did not do this. I also did not pack until the night before I left. I was flying from Heathrow and my mum very kindly booked me an airport hotel for the night before my trip, also highly recommended. I ended up scrabbling to pack between getting home from work and making the trip to the hotel and arriving far later than intended. I think I slept for something like 4 hours before I got up and headed over to the airport for my flight the next day in one of these cool pods. I think I saw Michael Gove at Pret, and with that I bade farewell to the UK. My flight departed at 9:35 am and was to land at Tokyo Haneda at 7:10 am the following day. The journey was about 13 hours. My seat actually didn't have a window, which was so sad. They served dinner quite early in the flight to try to adjust us to Japan time, and then I tried and failed to sleep for most of the rest of the flight. Eventually I landed, slightly delirious. My first picture in Japan was of this toilet at the airport. The airport experience was ridiculously smooth, the staff were very attentive and ready to help with everything. I took another video of a toilet and boarded the train to Shinagawa. I carried on straight from Shinagawa station to Osaka. Honestly, this whole journey was not bad, even on my own with 2 suitcases, a backpack and a tote bag. Multiple Japanese people approached me to offer help or answered questions I had, which immediately made me feel so welcome and comfortable. I spent most of the Shinkansen ride in another psychic realm produced by sleep deprivation, but I did get a nice picture of Fuji and of the leg space. I ordered my Shinkansen ticket months in advance to be physically delivered to me in the UK because after some research I found that while there are tickets set aside to buy on the day, they are few enough that to not risk not getting a seat it's best to pre-book. I don't know in retrospect if this was the best decision because I paid a very hefty proxy service fee, and later in my trip did manage to get these on-the-day tickets, albeit for more local trips. If you have any advice on this, please do share in the comments. I eventually made it to Shin Osaka and walked a short distance to my hotel. It was an APA hotel, which is, as I understand it, a kind of business hotel chain and quite affordable. I did assume for this reason that the staff might speak English, which they didn't, but as with all things customer service in Japan, check-in was a really clear and smooth process nonetheless. By this point I'd forgotten this, but I had paid a tiny bit extra because the site I was booking on recommended it to get a room on a slightly higher floor. The hotel was a tower and I was absolutely blown away by the view for a budget hotel. I had been planning to head back out and buy something for dinner but was exhausted and saw the hotel had a room service option, so I spent a few hours replying to messages before deciding it was time to eat. For the record, I have never studied Japanese and am nowhere near fluent or even able to speak grammatically correct Japanese, but I can read hiragana, katakana and some kanji and have managed to reach a kind of casual conversational level through a variety of exposure and practice. So I called the room service number with a plan of what to say, but was met with Japanese I could not understand, but appeared to be something about room service not being available. I fumbled for a while before giving up and apologising profusely. I have to say I never really struggled with culture shock or homesickness or any of the discomfort I prepared myself for before this visit, and this was probably the one exception. Entirely through my own poor planning, I had hardly eaten or slept for almost 48 hours at this point. and I was really humiliated and anxious because the member of staff on the phone had seemed quite frustrated by my inability to communicate with her. I was too physically and emotionally exhausted to go out and get food and just decided to sleep instead. I didn't sleep very well. I was waking up and sending delirious voice notes to friends and going back to sleep. I remember thinking, wow, I'm in Japan, and being surprised at how unforeign it felt and how calm I was. Perhaps because, despite being alone on a new continent, I knew I would be seeing my friend the next day, but more than anything because it was a trip I had wanted and prepared for such a long time. I felt ready. The next day I checked out of the hotel and planned to meet my friend nearby. Meeting an online friend in person for the first time is a special kind of thrill I never get tired of. We eventually found each other and headed over to his to drop off my bags. One thing I hadn't expected about visiting Japan in April and May was the weather, which was comparable to a good July and August in the UK. The temperatures were in the 20s and 30s, with few exceptions in the various places I visited, and the days were bright and sunny and a bit humid. On the whole, the weather was a little too warm for me, but beautiful and likely ideal for most. A perfect time to go between the rush of cherry blossom season and the fearsome heat of summer. We later headed out to Denden Town, Osaka's answer to Akihabara, and I had my first of many encounters with Japan's game centres, multi-floor buildings with all manner of gacha, UFO catcher and arcade machines. Also, UFO catchers in Japan are actually winnable. I didn't get any figures this time, but I did get pochita. We browsed a few shops and then went in search of a higurashi pachinko machine. Pachinko parlours were a cultural experience in themselves. I found them quite overwhelming. I don't know if this was playing on my mind because a large part of my job comprises working with people experiencing addiction, but they are largely unappealing environments, and it was hard to believe a good chunk of the patrons weren't struggling with this. I also hadn't really realised just how many franchises capitalised on the industry, and would have been drawing in fans the same way we were in search of a higurashi machine to view exclusive cutscenes. It was a slightly dystopian visage of consumerism taken to a particular extreme, and one I found interesting considering Japan's relationship to mental health. I think betting shops in the UK are universally considered to be quite depressing, if not embarrassing places to be seen, in part due to these associations with addiction. I wonder then how Japanese citizens view pachinko parlours, whether they have these same associations, and if not, whether that's due to a lack of awareness of the issue or unwillingness to confront it. Anyway, I don't plan to return to one of these establishments, though I was apparently a very lucky player, according to my friend. After this we found somewhere to eat ramen and then get a drink, and finally for my first of many karaoke sessions before we finally headed home. I loved Osaka. It had a distinct, laid-back vibe and so much character, and I could have happily spent my whole trip there exploring these side alleys and makeshift establishments where everything was cheap and delicious. It was a brilliant place to start my trip, and I immediately felt at home in the warmth of its citizens and streets. I think there was something to its unpolishedness that reminded me of home, and I had the impression that if I moved to Japan, this was where I'd want to live. The next morning we got up early and my friend drove us to his hometown in the countryside of Hiroshima Prefecture. I had obviously heard plenty about Japan's beautiful nature, but more in the form of snowy mountains and tropical islands. Nothing prepared me for the luscious, sun-soaked forests lining the motorway. Perhaps nothing special to somebody who took the route every day, but not quite like any landscape I'd seen before. We stopped off in the historical centre of the town, had a bite to eat and got to watch Kagura. Afterwards we headed to my friend's parents' house where we were staying for the night. His family prepared a barbecue and I had an amazing time talking to them. It was wonderful to experience their hospitality, and I was so happy to be able to communicate with them in Japanese and have all kinds of interesting conversations. I slept very well that night, truly at home. The next day we went into Hiroshima City. We walked through the Peace Memorial Park to the museum, which was perhaps the most impactful I've ever been to. It was packed full, but silent. There was a mixture of artwork, artifacts, and information dedicated to illustrating without restraint or omission the horror of what happened on the 6th and 9th of August 1945. The self-described purpose of the museum is to educate people about the destruction caused by nuclear weapons in the hope that they will eventually be abolished. The museum also hosts talks and has an audio guide narrated by survivors and relatives of victims and survivors of the A-bomb. It is, needless to say, a must visit if you're ever in Hiroshima. We also visited the A-bomb dome, one of the only structures near the hypercenter of the blast which survived, which has a really interesting history. The weather on this day was perfect. The sky completely clear, warm, sunny and breezy. I was immediately struck by how stunning Hiroshima was. Its white buildings, azure river, and almost ethereal serenity reminded me of southern Europe. I remember sitting in the Peace Memorial Park and feeling incredibly calm. After, we went to another arcade, did a bit of shopping, and set off back to Osaka during golden hour. The next day we made the 45-minute trip to Kyoto for the day. I'd read up on various famous sites but made the final decisions on what to do on my phone outside the station after we arrived, considering which it was a remarkably successful day. I was conscious that it wasn't that early, we also couldn't stay late, and that a lot of the recommended tourist spots were quite out of the way without a car, as well as that it was Golden Week and that I'd heard they were likely to be packed. I slightly perilously settled on Heian's Shrine and Fushimi Inari Taisha. We got the bus from the main station. I also learned at this point via the ire of a bus driver that buses in Japan work backwards to in the UK. You board from the middle section and pay as you're leaving through the front. Fortunately the day was all up from there. The main attraction for Heian's Shrine was a varied Japanese-style garden with a range of forested areas and ponds, which we bought our tickets to from a shrine maiden on the grounds. It was a lovely place to spend a few hours, a little oasis of nature in the city. On our way back to the bus stop, we stumbled across a local festival and sat down to grab something to eat and drink. There was a band playing whose songs were all themed around gyoza. It was great. Next, we travelled across the city to Fushimi Inari Taisha. We had to walk through some residential back streets to find the entrance, and watching kids coming home from school, passing the houses on these quiet roads, it was fun to think about all the normal lives being lived in this place so far from home. Experiences different yet parallel to my own. We got to the shrine, as I had hoped, as the sun was just beginning to set. Fushimi Inari Taisha is one of the places you've likely seen pictures of online when reading about Japan. Its path of hundreds of traditional red torii gates are an internationally famous photo opportunity. The actual grounds of the shrine are nice. They have a fun, buzzy atmosphere with a mixture of tourists from all over Japan and the world, as well as locals, and some stalls which I imagine multiply depending on the time of day, week and year. There's also the initial photo opportunity area, sure to have a queue. If you pass by this queue, however, you can begin to walk along the path laid out by the gates, which constitutes a great hike. We walked for about 30 minutes to one of the viewpoints out over the city before conceding to our tiredness, poor choice of footwear and the need to get back home. There was, however, a second viewpoint higher up, and the option to make a complete circuit for a 5-kilometre journey. This is a brilliant beginner's hike. There are some steep stairs, but it's all paved. There's plenty of room to turn back and descend alongside those continuing up, as many people were after progressing only as far as they wanted. There's shade from the sun in the form of the tall trees surrounding the path, and the views along the way are as worth the journey as the amazing sights of the city from above. Visiting at sunset was amazing, but I imagine the same can be said for any time of day. This was also where I began to realise I had uncovered a truly great deception. As previously explained, my choice of time of year for visiting Japan wasn't really up for debate due to my friend's schedule. This had concerned me a bit, as anything you read online will tell you not to visit Japan during Golden Week at all costs. Such is the extent of the hysteria that I read threads posted by frightened foreigners half set on cancelling their trips after realising they had, in their ignorance, made the grave mistake of booking for this time of year. The line is that Golden Week is when the Japanese all conduct their domestic tourism, and that already busy places like Kyoto are, as a result, suffocatingly crowded. Fushimi Inari Taisha wasn't empty, but it was busy at best, and actually quiet in some areas, including along the hike. As a side note, besides the entrance, there are plenty of great opportunities for pictures along the way, with no queue and less likelihood of being disturbed or disturbing. I discussed this with my friend later in the trip, and he did point out that Japan's Chinese tourism hadn't returned to pre-pandemic levels, but this obviously doesn't account for the expected domestic tourism at this time of year. The idea of discouraging visiting Japan during Golden Week obviously can't have come from nowhere, so I'm not really sure what to attribute my experience to and wouldn't take it as law or what to expect every year, but for what it's worth, I didn't experience the levels of people I had been preparing for anywhere during my trip across the country, and never felt like it was anywhere near busy enough that my enjoyment was disrupted. The weather was also ideal, and I have no qualms about the idea of visiting at this time of year again. After our impromptu hike, we left the shrine grounds, got the train back to the main station, and then the Hello Kitty bullet train back to Osaka. We were getting up at something like 4 AM the next day, and so I had been expecting to go straight home and to bed, but my friend, in the throes of a UFO catcher addiction, asked if we could stop by the arcade. I split off to play my first ever Project Diva arcade machine, a seminal experience for me. These aren't at every arcade, and I proceeded to spend the rest of my trip checking to see whether I was near one at any given point each day, so I can't really say anything about my friend. Finally, we found a local bar to grab a drink in. They had Spanish food and were playing artists like Two Door Cinema Club, which was fun and a bit surreal. It had such a cosy, friendly vibe that I could completely imagine it becoming my weekly go-to in the parallel universe where I lived in the city. It's impossible to pick a favourite day I had in Japan, but I think this one best captured what I love about travelling. A manageable selection of sightseeing spots which not only didn't disappoint but in some ways exceeded expectations, as well as all the serendipitous discoveries that you can only have in the in-between time you're trying to find the next place you're going, looking for somewhere to sit down, or spontaneously decide to pop in somewhere you've passed that's caught your eye. The next morning we got up at an ungodly hour and drove to Shirakawa-go, aka real-life Hinamizawa. Shirakawa-go is a World Heritage Site village in Gifu Prefecture that the 7th expansion team visited when creating the first chapter of the game, and the location used for many of the original background photos. It's since become something of a pilgrimage site for fans, with frequent events including a real-life Watanagashi festival held yearly, visits from staff involved with the series, dedicated merchandise sections in shops, collaborations with local cafes and more. It was, unsurprisingly, the bucket list entry on my bucket list trip. It still doesn't feel real that I've finally been. もう涙が嬉しい. I was extremely fortunate to be visiting with my friend who has been many times and knows all the Higurashi related spots, though there is a map you can pick up for these too. The relationship between Higurashi and Shirakawa-go is a fascinating one. On the one hand, you have a village that's nationally famous for its preservation of history, tradition and natural beauty, and on the other, a 2000s cult status pop culture phenomenon whose creators never predicted would reach the heights of fame and fandom it ultimately did. It's hard to say how this would have panned out were Shirakawa-go not already a popular travel destination, and tourism not a central tenet of its local economy. Still, the waves of both Japanese and foreign Higurashi fans who've been visiting and leaving their mark on the village for over 20 years now could have easily become a point of contention with the locals. Instead, those who call Shirakawa-go their home not only seem to have entirely embraced this mutually unexpected development, rather, in 2023, the two seem to have developed something of a symbiotic relationship. Shirakawa-go is small, with a central flat expanse and cluster of main streets where businesses and homes intermingle. It's busiest in the winter, where the village is buried under thick, picturesque blankets of snow, but receives visitors year-round. It was buzzy but still incredibly serene, and the sounds of nature were present everywhere you went. The flow of water through streams and rivers that pepper and encircle the village, and, of course, the chorus of insects. It was warm and sunny, but not too hot or humid. The air was almost unbelievably still. While almost all of Higurashi's central locations exist somewhere in the area, they've been plucked and planted into Hinamizawa's fictional geography at random, shrunken or enlarged and mashed together, so finding them around the village feels like a bit of a treasure hunt. We had some time to kill before we could check into our accommodation for the night, so we first swung by the bridge featured in Kai's opening, and then a restaurant and cafe called Shirakawa-go, who had a Higurashi cafe collaboration where you could get a coaster and sticker with your drink. Next, we wandered over to Hachiman Shrine. No explanation needed. There are lots of Higurashi Emma boards here, but my friend pointed out that this wasn't entirely appropriate as it's still a functioning shrine where locals pray, the typical purpose of these boards. Still, Higurashi Emma boards are sold in the village, and there's even one left by Rikishi, so it seems to be one of the inevitabilities the villagers have accepted. Next, we went to Gasho-zukuri Minkaen, one of the village's so-called open-air museums, where you can look around various traditional farmhouses and learn about the village's history and culture. The connecting gardens are lovely and also house a few more familiar sights. At some point we also tried to visit Purin no Ie, or Pudding House, which was unfortunately closed, but I've been reliably informed that their pudding is a must try. Soon it was time to check into our ryokan, a kind of traditional Japanese guest house. They served us some tea in our room, and after resting for a bit we headed back out in the late afternoon. We passed by Satoko and Rika's house and headed up the hill to the famous viewpoint. Tenbodai no Cafe, the cafe and shop by the observation deck, are also a must for Higurashi fans. The shop was closed on the day we visited, but as my friend knew the owners, they extremely kindly offered to let us in. There's a whole range of Higurashi merchandise that can only be purchased in Shirakawa-go, and certain things are only present at certain shops. I spent a lot of money, and then we grabbed some drinks and sat out on the decking overlooking the village. We bumped into another Higurashi fan my friend knew and chatted with him for a while, and the staff insisted we stay while they closed up, meaning we had the deck to ourselves. We headed back down the hill in the golden sun. I was a bit sunburned and so touched by the serendipity, warmth and hospitality experienced. A perfect afternoon. Back at the guest house we had a dinner in the lounge, a range of fresh, local produce and meat. As an aside, I was really struck by the reverence towards food in how the Japanese prepare meals. Often small, lovingly made portions. The way good food is seen as indispensable, hence the countless restaurants you'll find along any given street in any given city or town. Affordable enough to eat out multiple times a day. This time carved out to properly nourish yourself, a cultural given. Once the sun had set, we went out one last time for an evening walk. The village takes on a very different atmosphere at this time, once the tourists visiting for the day have all drained out. We took another walk around the shrine, now completely empty, then decided to go to Keiichi's house. My friend remembered this as being a short walk. It actually took like an hour, including a stop at a convenience store, and was pitch black by the time we got there, but this walk is one of my fondest memories from the trip.
I know!
変な建物会社なら It's a strange building for a company、まあ写真は無理、まあそうだね、さすがケイチ家族、ケイチの家族、そうそうそう、ケイチの I do know how to say things. I just Really? No, actually これがケイチハウス、また明日見に行こうよ。Try to come again. 車で？Maybe. Yes. まあ、I don't mind. まあ、夕方。Oh, okay. 夕方、how do you say? Okay. How do you say? Evening, yes. And we can have rounds to Japanese lesson. でも、多分、still 無理。The next morning we drove half an hour to Shichiken Tobitsuribashi, otherwise known as Satoko-bashi or Satoko Bridge. It's a bit off the beaten path and not an essential to visit, but during the trip we also swung by the nearby Miboro Electric Power Museum. The museum documents, amongst other things, fervent but ultimately fruitless protests against the building of the Miboro Dam, constructed on the river in the late 1950s, a project which led to the submerging of several villages home to over 1,000 people. I wasn't personally aware that this particular element of Higurashi's lore was based in real events, so it was a fascinating discovery. Once again we had time to kill before checking into our next accommodation, so we did some wandering. We first visited Kataribe, another souvenir shop and cafe with a Higurashi collaboration. They had a little seating area outside also decorated with merchandise. We then headed back up to the observation deck again, early enough to get a souvenir photo taken this time. The next stop was Kanda House, another open gasho tsukuri house with multiple floors full of tools and implements to look at. We stopped by a small cafe called China where I had my first ever cola kakigori or shaved ice. Then we were able to check into our next guest house, Magoemon. Our extended stay in Shirakawa-go was purely for the sake of staying at Magoemon before we continued on to Tokyo, something my friend insisted we do, as they didn't have a room available on our first night. We were lucky to get one at all. They only have a handful of rooms, are mega popular, bookings come in many months in advance for the peak tourist seasons, you can't book a room for just one person and must be in a pair or larger group, and reservations have to be made over the phone, aka in Japanese. It's probably the priciest guest house in the village at about 25,000 yen per night, but this is still a steal for the experience of staying there. Magoemon is one of the buildings where photos were taken to use for the Sonozaki house interior, including the genkan or entryway, and hallway where Mion and Shion have their conversation on the night of the festival in Meyakashi. We had our own large lounge of sorts and a shared engawa or veranda where we chilled for a bit before we headed back out to kill time before dinner. This time we visited Wada House, another of the places where photos were taken for the Sonozaki house. Next, back at Magoemon, we had a beautiful, elaborate multi-course dinner consisting of fresh local produce and meat, which I really enjoyed. My favourite part was this fish, which was cooked on a stick by the fire in the middle of the room. All the guests ate together. That night there was a Japanese family and a European couple who we got talking to. The staff chatted with us while we ate and advised that we take a nighttime walk and see the houses around the village all lit up. The couple invited us out with them and we had a great time walking around and chatting. Both guest houses had a single bathroom with different slots for each room to use it, and yukata to put on and wear around the building once you were done. Bathing in Japan is quite different to the West. You first shower outside of the bath to cleanse yourself, then bathe for a short period for health and relaxation. The baths in the ryokan can be very deep, spacious and luxurious feeling. One of the benefits of ryokan is the ability to speak with the often knowledgeable staff about the history of the area, something we were able to do that night. The staff were all exceptionally lovely and hospitable. We explained to the man we spoke to that night that we were there as Higurashi fans, and spoke about what the village was actually like in the era the story was written in. Ryukishi and other 7th expansion staff have returned to Magoemon over the years, and there was a guest book with signatures we were invited to take a look at. Like so much of the village, the staff at Magoemon aren't only very much aware of, but have completely embraced the unexpected relationship between their small business and the fans who've sought them out. A sentiment I encountered throughout my trip was a sort of humble amazement that I'd travel so far because of my interest in the series, and a genuine joy and pride in the ability to share the local culture, history and tradition with foreigners thanks to this. It struck me as an incredibly gracious approach to the phenomenon. After the conversation we went to bed. We had a second private room aside from the lounge where the futons were laid out for us. I fell asleep listening to the river outside. It would have been so easy at any point during this part of the trip to become overwhelmed by the fact that I was in Hinamizawa, but it both did and didn't feel that way. In spite of it all, Shirakawa-go impressed its own identity onto me, and I'll always remember it as one of the most special places I have ever had the privilege of visiting for so much more than its associations with this series I love. On Friday morning we had another elaborate breakfast before setting off towards Tokyo. We drove to Nagoya, then got the bullet train the rest of the way. This was so that we could attend a 7th expansion event in the Nihonbashi area. First we checked into our hotel for the night, another APA. I was able to store my luggage and then we walked to the event. We arrived late in the day but managed to quickly look around the artist alley type area. We were both able to chat with a few Twitter friends and I was able to buy a KME book and charm from one of my mutuals. Cosplay and Ita bags abounded. There was a floor with themed drinks and another with games themed around different 7th expansion titles. If you got a stamp from each stall you could pick a prize. My friend gave me his win, a Mion mug. Finally there was a talk show with Ryukishi himself. where they announced the stage adaptation of episode 2 of Umineko and Higurashi Origin, amongst other things. Needless to say, being in the same room as the man himself and a few hundred other fans at most was very surreal. There's a huge disparity between the levels of popularity When They Cry has reached and the tight-knit, homely vibe events like these have managed to preserve. So true to the series' Doujin Circle origins. No doubt something deliberate on the part of 7th expansion. After the event, a group of about 10 of us went to an izakaya where a room had been hired in advance, where we stayed late into the night. It was a really special few hours. I was with a mixture of people I knew and didn't, but I was completely welcomed even with my subpar Japanese, and had so much fun talking to everyone. After, my friend and I grabbed some ramen at a small restaurant and then headed back to the hotel to rest. I was hyper aware my entire trip of not being the rude foreigner, in my lack of fluent and thus potentially impolite Japanese, or else my lack of awareness and fumbling of social rules and expectations. Despite having heard about it for so long, one of the biggest surprises I experienced in Japan was the genuine hospitality and general kindness of almost everybody I interacted with. I had always assumed this hospitality went hand in hand with the importance placed on manners and politeness, and thus expected something more stiff and perfunctory. Instead, whether in convenience stores or train stations, with friends or acquaintances, across the many places I visited, and with few exceptions, people were just so lovely. As I said, I never really experienced any kind of culture shock while I was in Japan, and I'm sure this was a large contributor. I do think my attempts to speak Japanese, even imperfectly, went a long way in helping form genuine connections and dispelling any lingering trepidation in engaging with me on the other party's part, but strangers still weren't deterred from approaching me even without knowing whether I spoke a word of the language. While I understand experiencing Japan as a foreigner and tourist is a very different thing to being from and living there, and that there are different expectations and allowances made, this overall really destroyed my misconception of the Japanese as a universally reserved people. It's easy to visit another country as a tourist without really engaging with its mundanities or people, and I really enjoyed all these interactions, both big and small, that I was able to have over the course of the trip. The next morning was my last with my friend before we parted ways. We checked out of the hotel, though I was again able to store my luggage, and headed to Akihabara nearby. We killed some time at yet another arcade and then finally sat down at a cafe. We said goodbye at the station and I headed to the airport to meet the friend I'd be spending the rest of the trip with. A close online friend travelling from the US who I was finally meeting in person for the first time after 10 years. Once we'd met up, we picked up my luggage back at the hotel and then got a taxi to our Airbnb in the Minowa area where we chilled out for the rest of the day. I spent many hours poring over Airbnb listings prior to the trip, and so I'm happy to say we had a very positive experience. We stayed at this Airbnb for 12 nights in total, so I really wanted to make sure it was the right place. Tokyo is a huge city and there was a lot to consider. The size of the apartment, the area it was in, the transport links, the amenities, and of course the price. We settled on somewhere that seemed decent in all these respects rather than sacrificing some things for others. The place we ultimately chose was a typical open plan space with a sliding door separating the room we slept in and the kitchen/dining/laundry area, as well as an all-in-one toilet and bathroom. There was also ample storage for our many bags and suitcases. Perhaps the only problem we ran into was finding somewhere to hang all of our laundry to dry. There are so many kinds of neighbourhoods in Tokyo that all provide a very different experience. We weren't the closest to popular areas like Shinjuku or Shibuya, but were less than 10 minutes walk from Minowa station, also had access to bus routes and were ultimately able to get everywhere we wanted to go pretty easily. Our neighbourhood had everything we needed, was relatively quiet, and allowed us to stay somewhere a bit cheaper and bigger. We were also walking distance from the historic Asakusa, which allowed us to explore it later in the day once the tourists had emptied out. Skytree was similarly close, and Akihabara was only a few stops on the train. There's not really a right place to stay in Tokyo, it really depends on your priorities for your trip. However, I definitely wouldn't recommend blowing your budget or compromising your comfort for the chance to stay in the heart of the city unless you're certain that's an experience you want, especially not on account of avoiding the great and easily navigable public transport system. Luckily we were able to craft a comfortable little home for our time in the city and explore some areas we might not have otherwise in the process. It was pouring on the Sunday and we took things easy, grabbing groceries and popping into a local cafe to have Japanese pancakes, which were both amazing and too indulgent for me to have more than a quarter of. As a side note, Japan loves its drinks. This was a strawberry yogurty smoothie and was as delicious as all the other drinks I had for the first time in Japan. In the UK, if it's not alcohol or coffee, drinks often feel like an afterthought, but in Japan so many businesses put just as much care and thought into this part of their menu as the food. The next day we made a proper trip to Akihabara, though still not enough to scratch the surface. I had intended to return later in the trip, and didn't get around to it, so unfortunately, or fortunately depending on how you look at it, didn't visit a lot of the shops I wanted to. On this occasion we first visited Mandarake Complex, which had many floors of all kinds of second-hand goods. One had Boys Love doujinshi for every, and I mean every, series you could feasibly imagine. There was something really refreshing about being in this sort of physical space, the absolute lack of shame or bashfulness associated with it all. Time and again in these sorts of shops I wondered what sort of experience I would have had as somebody with my interests had I grown up in Japan. It was a little bittersweet. I go most into my actual experience of this in my video on Vocaloid, the fandom where I met the friend I was with during this part of my trip, one that dominated my early adolescence. There was a time where I so craved these simple things. The ability to buy this obscure piece of merchandise or attend that event, or simply physically exist somewhere where others shared the same passions, and where I could be openly invested and excited. I spent a lot of time on this trip wandering around various branches of shops like Animate and feeling just a bit sad, not being a fan of almost any of the series dominating the shelves, thinking about a time where I would have lived and breathed everything there, where I wanted so desperately to be stood where I was at that moment, the sense of being too late. And I spent a lot of the trip thinking about belonging, community, things I most definitely got to experience, as well as all the ways they had evaded me, a beautiful and complex set of emotions. Also wondering how the hell anime fans in Japan function with the staggering amount of capital you can and will pour into this stuff. Japan can feel a little dystopian in how meticulously its consumerist culture has been crafted. If there is a way to extract money from you, they've thought of it. And the worst part is that almost everything is actually well designed and made and genuinely desirable. Just like what I was saying about the drinks, there's a real sense of wanting the consumer to have a good experience, a sort of care that goes into everything, no matter how small, that I really don't see in the UK. When it comes to bits of plastic, it's still a ploy to get you to spend money. I'm still cynical about it, and I still indulge in it. In one of my more jarring segues, my friend really wanted to go to a maid cafe, so this was where we ended up next. I wasn't sure how I felt about this. I wasn't unequivocally opposed to the idea, but it's not something I would have done of my own volition. It was an interesting experience. The maid cafe wasn't really themed, and there were also some butlers, though we didn't interact with any. I got a melon soda and we were given little loyalty cards one of the maids filled out for us with our names. Princess Bess in my case. We had a few different maids serve us at different points, and we had a lot of fun chatting, saying where we were from, being complimented on our Japanese and accessories and complimenting and what have you. It honestly didn't feel that artificial, and not only on account of our perhaps being a break from male customers, there were all sorts of configurations of groups at the different tables. My friend, to my dismay, ordered a magical drink that required us to cast a spell along with the maid who served it. I may have had to say moe moe kyun. I can't say I don't at least slightly understand the appeal of working at a maid cafe. I am personally a fan of sweet lolita and other very feminine fashion, of feeling pretty and cute. Maid cafes operate on a strict set of rules governed by respect for the staff. We were given a list to read stating we mustn't touch the maids. I think there might have been something about not asking for numbers. You had to pay to take pictures with them, which were the only pictures allowed, etc. There are patrons, many regulars with favourite maids, who abide strictly by these rules. But while this can often be out of genuine respect, it's also hard not to see this absolutely necessary but very particular culture as its own kind of objectification. You can look but you can't touch, paid for interactions, and a sort of parasocial relationship where the consumer is still the one with the ultimate power that exists on the same spectrum as hostess bars, rental girlfriends, and ultimately prostitution. And then there's the undoubted sexual harassment that will happen in these settings. The question of how many women do it because they want to versus it being accessible, necessary employment, and the base sexism of the entire concept. I'm rapidly regretting my decision to unpack this here, let's move on. I had a nice time talking to the staff. I hope they were as happy with their jobs as they seemed to be. Next we went to, you guessed it, an arcade. We spent maybe an hour on the rhythm game floor, then treated ourselves to some karaoke before heading home. On Tuesday we'd booked to go to Team Lab Planets, a museum with a series of interactive art pieces. I'm not gonna lie guys, I didn't really rate it. It was fun, but dare I say overhyped. You move through a number of different rooms with the idea being to engage all 5 senses, which I did appreciate. I think I may have enjoyed it more if it didn't feel largely like a lot of Instagram picture opportunities, which is how most people were treating it. I don't regret going, it's just not a must in my opinion. Also, look up what clothes they recommend you wear before because there's water and all sorts of stuff. Next, my friend wanted to visit the Starbucks roastery, which, considering I don't drink coffee, was pretty cool. They had a ground floor where you could watch the roastery function. There was a really nice gift shop, a regular Starbucks to order from, I got a pistachio pastry, and a bakery. There were other floors focused on tea and cocktails respectively, and the top one had a really nice outside decking area which wasn't too busy. After this we took a nice walk through the neighbourhood towards sleek Shibuya. It was a great time of day to visit with all the lights coming on for the night. We Shibuya scrambled and had a browse through the Shibuya 109 shopping centre, largely comprised of clothes shops, which was my personal heaven and hell. I wanted everything. Finally, we headed home. On the Wednesday we spent the day chilling at home, but did go out in the evening to look around Osaka. First, we explored the grounds of the stunning Sensoji or Asakusa Kannon Temple. Tokyo's oldest temple opened in 645 AD. I drew this ominous fortune, way too much of this came true actually, and tied it to this rack, which apparently nullifies it. Didn't work for me, I'm ad-libbing here guys. Then we got drinks from a vending machine and sat down. There was a nice vibe, a mixture of tourists, people passing through on their way home, and friends gathered to chat. One person saw me taking pictures and asked if I'd like him to take a picture of me with the temple, and we had a nice conversation. Then my friend went shopping and I split off to go for a walk along the Sumida River and back towards home. On Thursday we went shopping in Ikebukuro, which was a long but otherwise easy ride on the bus from our Airbnb. Our main stop of the day was Capcom Cafe, located inside a shopping centre called Grandscape Ikebukuro. I'm just listening to that car go by, but I can't be bothered to redo this take. They had a Sumiko Gurashi collaboration going on. I got teriyaki chicken and a soda float type drink, which was actually really good. This is now my work water bottle. I managed to pick up some Ace Attorney merch, but there wasn't loads sadly. We spent yet more time in an arcade, then went to the nearby Sunshine City, another shopping centre. I discovered my ultimate downfall, Donguri, a chain of Ghibli goods stores I somehow didn't know existed before this. We may or may not have gone to karaoke again before heading back. On Friday my friend booked to get her hair done at a salon in Harajuku. I met up with her there later in the day. I really liked Harajuku. It defied my expectations in many ways. Shibuya's approach to fashion, however much these styles appealed to me, was somewhat stifling. Something that really struck me about Japan was how women overwhelmingly presented themselves. Pristine, almost universally feminine outfits and perfect makeup and hair. I'd look around at commuters and think about how at home it was standard for women to show up to work in smart casual, sure, but equally in clothes that suited their personal style, or gym wear, or tracksuits depending on the day or weather or for utility. As much as Japanese women's fashion is more in line with my personal taste, I never bothered looking at clothes in Japan, because I was on a budget and had limited space to bring things back with me, yes, but also because I knew Japanese fashion simply wouldn't allow for my utterly average in the UK size or figure. I found myself hyper aware of my appearance, impacted by the seeming culture of perfection. It's one of the more immediately evident ways Japan's lagging attitude towards gender roles manifests. Only knowing of Harajuku as the fashion capital of Japan, I had expected a somehow even more concentrated version of this, which only shows how little I knew about Harajuku. I was greeted almost immediately after getting off the train by somebody accompanied by a meerkat on a lead. We wandered around indiscriminately for a few hours, and I was struck by how non-conformist it all was. There were all kinds of fashion, brand name shops as well as cheaper ones, and ads all over boasting models of varying sizes. Even when we browsed one of the more expensive shops, the young assistant was friendly and unfussy, encouraging us to try clothes, giving recommendations and chatting happily. The whole area, centred around the famous Takeshita Street, was simultaneously buzzy and chilled, kitsch and proud. Tourists and locals milled around and intermingled. People posed for photos, tinny music rang out and vendors vied for attention. It reminded me resoundingly of London's Camden Market, or at least how it might have been before it became a bit too touristy. Away from the main thoroughfare, there were plenty of nice, quiet streets to stroll through, and it struck me as a great place to stop for a coffee on a sunny afternoon. It was one of the realer, more relaxed places I visited whilst in Tokyo, and has stuck with me for that reason. After this, we headed briefly over to Shinjuku to visit a camping gear rental store. My friend and I decided to do one trip somewhere outside of Tokyo while we were there, and seeing as I'd already spent a week traipsing around the country, I let her have the final call on where. We toyed with visiting an onsen town, but settled on a music festival featuring a lot of artists she liked, FUJI and Sun. As the name betrays, the festival was located in the foothills of Mount Fuji in Shizuoka Prefecture, and we had opted to camp, a first for me. My friend rented some equipment in advance from Yamadogu rental shop which we went to collect, but after a conversation with the staff they made some alternative recommendations, sleeping bags that wouldn't be as heavy to carry back if it rained as predicted and they got wet, and an easier tent to set up for beginners. They were extremely friendly and helpful, and it was a lovely insight into this particular community-driven subculture that really made me want to explore it further. We were later able to drop the rental gear at a local convenience store to be shipped back to the company, super handy. We brought our things home and had an early night before our journey the next day. On Saturday we got the metro to a central station and then the bullet train to Shin Fuji station, where a shuttle bus picked us up and took us into the foothills of the mountain. As an aside, my friends and I actually looked at getting tickets for a few different concerts while we were in Japan and found it largely impossible due to rules around needing to have a Japanese address, phone number and so on to make purchases like this. Strict vetting of concert goers ensuring buyers and ticket holders are one and the same, I presume to deter proxies and scalpers, and the lack of affordable and reliable proxy services, likely as a result of this. This was essentially the only event of this kind we were successful in getting tickets for, thanks to my friend finding a proxy, and when we went to pick up the tickets at the post office we still ended up having to fill out some Japanese paperwork and explain why our own address and so on didn't match that of the buyer. I undoubtedly would have gone to at least one more concert while I was in Japan had this all not been the case. If anybody has any tips on buying concert tickets as somebody living outside of the country, please do let me know. Back to the foothills of Mount Fuji, we spent maybe 40 minutes driving up into the lowest part of the mountain. I actually felt my ears pop as we went up. Once we arrived at the setting, an area called Mount Fuji Children's World, we got our wristbands and walked for a further 20 minutes or so to the campsite. By this point, rain had begun to fall and we had realised we were exceptionally ill-prepared. I didn't even have a raincoat. Nonetheless, we somehow managed to successfully assemble our tent without too much trouble, despite our inexperience and the worsening weather. The weather was terrible all weekend. Torrential rain, chilly wind and so much mud, and we spent most of it soaked to the bone. But it was a learning experience and I felt like I'd earned a badge of honour by the end. It's easy to imagine how idyllic the festival would have been in the late spring sun, but the rain added its own atmosphere. I knew almost none of the artists and had fun drifting between the two stages and around the food stalls, sometimes with my friend and sometimes alone, before seeking moments of respite in the relative shelter of our tiny tent. Fuji and Sun is a small, family-friendly festival, and the music is a mixture of mostly more downbeat folk, jazz and rock, with a focus on experimental and indie artists. The vast majority of people at the festival were Japanese, and it felt overwhelmingly like our efforts had been rewarded with an extremely special, exclusive experience. I loved every set I listened to across the 2 days, and discovered many great artists. Ego Rappin, Yuta Orisaka, Kero, Never Young Beach, Yuga and Rothbart Baron were highlights. The festival closed with its headliner, Asian Kung Fu Generation, a particularly special experience as it was such an intimate performance for a band on their level. On Sunday night we headed back down the mountain and back to our Airbnb in Tokyo with a new appreciation for showers, washing machines and futons. My last few days in Tokyo were quiet. We recuperated and headed out on Tuesday evening to Skytree. While we waited for our slot, we wandered around Soramachi, the humongous shopping centre that occupies the base of the tower. This place is amazing and you could easily sink days into it, highly recommended for retail therapy. We visited the Ghibli character goods store again, as well as the Shonen Jump store they had, and then we headed up the tower. Skytree is fun, but there's not much to say about it, and I dare say it's overrated, though I'm not sure if this is the fact that I grew up in a big city speaking. Tokyo is an almost incomprehensible place, sprawling and densely populated as it is. I think Skytree would have been an interesting place to reflect on this while looking out across the city if it weren't teeming with tourists. It is surprisingly cheap to visit the observation deck, however, and it won't eat up much of your day, so go for it if you feel so inclined. After this we went for another karaoke session and then walked home through Osaka. I spent my last day getting my luggage ready and resting before my flight to Korea the following morning. And that was my trip to Japan. Did I go to any Umineko locations? No. Somehow, nowhere in my intensive planning for this trip, which spanned multiple Google Docs, did it occur to me to visit Furukawa Gardens despite how fucking long I was in Tokyo. I don't understand how this happened. I'm so sorry, Umineko fans. Something for next time. Did I pick up any cool things? Too many. And did seeing Japan in person reinforce some of the notions or conclusions I've drawn in my essays prior to the trip? This is a really interesting question, and one I'm going to selfishly use as more of a jumping off point to reflect on my trip as a whole. Japan is definitely the most different country to where I live that I've ever been to, and yet thanks to my interest in it long predating my trip, it didn't feel nearly as foreign as I'd expected. I think the wonder of travel has been slightly diluted by advancements in technology. Far-flung lands we once knew of only through stories and paintings have become accessible to the point of commodification. Japan is quote-unquote known to us through photo, video, dissemination of media and art, the internet allowing us to meet people across the globe, learn their language, hear their voices. This is, of course, a wondrous thing, and growing up at a time where all of this is possible has shaped who I am to my core. This is the foundation of my channel and something I've spoken about in videos in the past. This was at this point far from the first time I was travelling and making a connection with somebody in real life thanks to the internet. In the past I dated an American and wondered at the fact that she lived in the same city as extended family of mine. Looked at pictures of myself there as a child and wondered if, just maybe, we'd passed each other on the street, years before we'd meet. As an adult I moved to a part of the UK I'd never so much as visited before to complete my master's degree, and ended up serendipitously in the same city as online friends I'd likely never have met offline otherwise, and had only tenuously kept in contact with over the years, but who welcomed me into an unfamiliar place. Their presence a reassurance even in the depths of lockdown, the relationships now solidified. My experience of the internet is one of enabling connections waiting to happen. I remember being friends with someone online as a kid, knowing they also lived in London, but only realising when they posted a photo one day that they went to a school near mine, that we took the same bus route every day, had almost definitely crossed paths at some point, knowing and not knowing one another. There was a specific age to grow up online where we all simply knew too little, had too little precedent to understand the dangers of sharing ourselves in this way, pumping information into this incomprehensibly far-reaching network used for all purposes with abandon. Now, when I talk to colleagues who've banned their teenagers from posting pictures of themselves online and only have strictly regimented access to social media, I feel relief. I've heard enough horror stories, and had my share of bad and outright dangerous experiences too. Every generation is defined by the world it was reared in, with its heritage of music, films, cultural events and traumas. We'll keep making the same mistakes, but I hope, perhaps idealistically, that in that, generations of adults to come will also have a world that opens up before them, limitless and with little that can separate them from others. I hope that our dumb belief in the goodness of other people prevails and continues to lead us into unknown places. There were things about Japan that were exactly as I expected and things that weren't, but I spent so little of the time I was there thinking about the books and research I'd read, about stereotypes and myths. My overwhelming sense was of how even the utterly foreign can feel familiar when you have the comfort of a friendly face, and of how inevitable connection is with all the tools at our disposal in this day and age. At the end of the day, more than my want to visit Shirakawa-go or Akihabara, to see artists I love live or visit places I've pored over pictures of, what led me to finally get my ticket was one of these connections. And the most profound moments of the trip were found while tucked into a futon on the floor of the room where my friend's mum worked during the day. A friend I hadn't even known a year prior, who just happened to bravely send me a message one day, and begin something that led me to that night, all the way out in the countryside of Hiroshima Prefecture, so far from home and everything I knew, drifting off to sleep, completely safe and content. Anyway, I hope you found something to enjoy in this long, indulgent and rather different video for me. Next time I'll be back to my usual fare, but just as I use my channel to document memorable experiences with my favourite media, I wanted to create this video as a time capsule to dive back into whenever I want to reminisce on this trip, hopefully the first of many. Thank you for joining me on the journey, and I'll see you next time.